In the spring of 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower made a decision that still divides military historians. With Berlin weeks from falling, he turned the main weight of the American army away from the Nazi capital and pointed it south toward Bavaria and Austria. His intelligence chiefs had told him why. The Nazis, they said, were building an impregnable mountain fortress in the Alps, an Alpine Redoubt, an Alpenfestung. As many as 100,000 fanatical SS troops dug into positions that couldn't be dislodged by conventional assault. Underground armament factories, safe from Allied bombers. Enough food and ammunition stockpiled to fight on for years after Berlin itself had fallen. A guerrilla war that could drag on indefinitely, bleeding the occupying armies for a decade. Eisenhower believed them. He redirected entire army groups to stop it. It didn't exist. None of it. There was no fortress, no hidden army, no underground factories humming away beneath the rock. The most powerful military commander in the Western world had just reorganized the final campaign of a world war round a story that wasn't true. The Alpenfestung was one of the greatest bluffs of the Second World War. There were no 100,000 SS troops waiting in the mountains. There were no underground factories humming beneath the rock. There were no stockpiles of food and ammunition built to outlast a siege. There wasn't even a real, resourced plan, just rumor, forged paperwork, and a propaganda office in Berlin working overtime. Here's the key thing. None of that mattered. The lie worked so completely that it redirected the final campaign of the war in Europe and may have helped decide who controlled Berlin when the shooting finally stopped. This is the story of how a fiction outperformed an army, and how a World War II intelligence failure quietly helped draw the map of post-war Europe. To understand how the Allies fell for this, you need to understand where they stood in late 1944. This was not an army in a mood to take chances, and it was not an intelligence apparatus with much room to second-guess itself under pressure. The advance across France had been fast, almost euphoric. Through the summer, Paris liberated in August, Allied spearheads racing toward the German border by September. Then it stalled. Operation Market Garden, the airborne gamble to seize a corridor into the Netherlands and end the war by Christmas, failed badly at Arnhem. Supply lines stretched thin, the front hardened, and for the first time since Normandy, the advance ground almost to a halt. Then, in December, the Germans launched something almost nobody in Allied high command believed they still had the strength for. A massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. For a few tense weeks that winter, American units were overrun, encircled, and pushed back, and it looked like Germany might still have real teeth left in it after all. By early 1945, the question hanging over every Allied planning room wasn't really, will Germany lose? It was, how does Germany lose, and who gets to Berlin first? The Americans and British on one side, the Soviets grinding forward from the east through Poland on the other. Into that atmosphere, jumpy, casualty-conscious, freshly reminded that the Wehrmacht could still bite even in its death throes, a rumor about a hidden Nazi stronghold in the mountains landed like a gift. The rumor had a real template to borrow from. Switzerland had genuinely built a National Redoubt strategy of its own, the Swiss Redoubt with roots reaching back to Alpine defense planning in the 1880s, and formally adopted as national doctrine in 1940 under General Henri Guisan, the commander-in-chief of the Swiss armed forces. Facing a Germany that had just conquered France in 6 weeks, Switzerland's actual plan was to abandon its lowland cities if invaded, and withdraw its entire army into the Alps, where a small, well-supplied force could theoretically hold out against a much larger invader, almost indefinitely. The Swiss had actually fortified their mountain passes with concrete gun emplacements. They'd actually dug tunnels deep into the rock and stockpiled years of supplies inside them. This wasn't rumor or propaganda, it was real, funded, engineered defense policy, and Allied intelligence officers knew all about it. So when scattered reports started arriving in 1944 about a German version of the same idea, analysts did something understandable and completely wrong. They took a real, well-documented Swiss strategy and mapped it directly onto the Germans, assuming the Nazis were quietly building the same kind of mountain sanctuary just a few hundred miles to the north. That single assumption is the foundational error this entire story flows from. Here's what makes this so remarkable. The Alpenfestung wasn't purely invented from nothing. Heinrich Himmler had sketched an actual, if never resourced, concept for a government retreat into the Alps back in November and December of 1943. The idea that a mountainous belt running from southern Bavaria across western Austria into northern Italy could function as a last redoubt for Germany's government and armed forces if the capital ever fell. It went nowhere. Hitler never fully endorsed it, and no serious construction, troop allocation, or supply stockpiling ever followed the initial paperwork. It sat as one contingency memo among dozens, circulating through a regime that, by late 1943, was already quietly bracing for the possibility of losing. But the germ of a real plan existed, buried in a drawer, with Himmler's own name attached to it, and that's exactly the kind of half-true seed that makes a propaganda campaign land. A total fabrication is easier to disprove than a real idea that simply never got built. And the myth had just enough real activity behind it to keep looking credible. In February 1945, the SS did actually evacuate the rocket scientists working on the V2 program from the Peenemünde Research Center, moving them south toward the Alpine region as Soviet forces closed in from the east. Around the same time, SHAEF began receiving genuine reports that German military, government, and Nazi party offices were relocating their staff toward the area around Berchtesgaden, the small Bavarian town that had been home to Hitler's private mountain retreat, the Berghof, and the fortified tea house above it that American troops would later nickname the Eagle's Nest. None of this was evidence of a fortress. It was mostly bureaucratic reshuffling and a genuine effort to protect a handful of valuable scientists from advancing Soviet troops. But to an intelligence analyst already primed to expect an Alpine stronghold, it read as confirmation. Here's what makes this so remarkable. The myth didn't need much real material to work with. A few true, unremarkable facts, filtered through an existing fear, did most of the heavy lifting. Joseph Goebbels found that seed and planted it. American press had already started speculating about a Nazi mountain hideaway on its own. The New York Times magazine ran a piece called Hitler's Hideaway in November 1944. Describing an impregnable fortress supposedly under construction near Berchtesgaden, Hitler's own mountain retreat. Goebbels didn't need to start the fire. He needed to feed it. In December 1944, he called German editors to a secret meeting and explicitly forbade any domestic mention of an Alpine Redoubt, while simultaneously making sure the story kept circulating through neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland, where it would filter back into Allied hands anyway. In January 1945, he escalated further, standing up a dedicated propaganda section whose entire job was manufacturing convincing detail. Impregnable fortifications carved into rock, elite Alpine divisions, secret weapons, an underground Reich that would keep fighting for years after Berlin fell. His own intelligence service, the SD, produced fake construction blueprints and fabricated supply manifests to back it up. The American press, primed and willing, ran with it. Collier's Weekly published a detailed feature in late January 1945, describing elite SS and Hitler Youth units training for exactly this kind of last stand. Time magazine speculated that top Nazi officials would retreat behind a rear guard of loyal militia into a mountain massif stretching from southern Bavaria across western Austria into northern Italy, stocked with immense stores of food and ammunition. None of it was real. All of it was designed to be believed, and by early 1945, it was being believed by exactly the audience Goebbels wanted reading it. Allen Dulles became one of the most important channels feeding this fiction straight into Allied high command. He'd arrived in Bern in November 1942, officially attached to the American legation, unofficially running the OSS's most productive European listening post of the entire war. Over the next 3 years, he built a genuinely valuable network of German contacts, anti-Nazi diplomats, resistance-linked officers, defectors passing him real high-grade intelligence, including early details on Germany's V-weapon programs. That reputation was exactly the problem. Reports stamped with the credibility of the OSS Bern station carried enormous weight by 1945, but some of what was reaching Dulles's sources by early that year had already passed through Goebbels' fabrication machine, leaked, planted, or exaggerated by German officers with their own reasons to inflate the threat, whether to curry favor, buy time, or simply pass along what they themselves had been told to believe. Dulles had no reliable way to separate the genuine resistance intelligence from the propaganda riding alongside it. Is that a failure of judgment, or just the nature of running human intelligence inside a collapsing country full of desperate, self-interested men? Either way, his reporting helped carry the myth several steps closer to Eisenhower's desk, wrapped in a level of institutional trust that made it far harder to question. And then, the myth became official. On March 11, 1945, SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, issued its weekly intelligence summary, number 51. It treated the Alpine Redoubt as fact, not rumor. Elite SS and mountain divisions, underground armament plants, food reserves built for a prolonged campaign. A defending force estimated around 100,000 men capable of holding out indefinitely. Some individual assessments feeding into SHAEF that same spring pushed the estimate even higher, into the hundreds of thousands, depending on which informant's report a given analyst happened to be reading that week. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. A document like this doesn't stay a rumor once it's stamped, filed, and circulated as a formal intelligence product. It becomes institutional truth. Every commander below Eisenhower who read that summary was now operating on the assumption that the Alpenfestung was real, because the official intelligence machinery of the Western Allies had just told them it was. One post-war historian would later call it one of the worst intelligence assessments of the entire war. But almost nobody suspected that in March of 1945. Why would they? It had come from their own side. The strategic consequences followed almost immediately. Eisenhower shifted the main weight of the American advance away from Berlin and toward the south, not a minor adjustment, but a redirection of enormous force. Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group and Jacob Dever's 6th Army Group both pushed through Bavaria and into Austria. Columns of tanks and infantry grinding toward Berchtesgaden and the Brenner Pass, the historic gateway between Austria and Italy that any real defense of a southern redoubt would have needed to control chasing a fortress that existed only on paper. It wasn't the only reason for that decision. Berlin had already been provisionally assigned to the Soviet occupation zone by prior Allied agreement, and Eisenhower was genuinely wary of the casualties a direct assault on the heavily defended capital would cost his own men. But the Alpenfestung intelligence was a real and significant factor in that calculus, weighing on a decision some of Eisenhower's own commanders, including George Patton, actively argued against, believing a fast strike toward Berlin was still both possible and worthwhile, and that the Alpine threat was being wildly overstated by desk-bound intelligence officers who'd never have to fight through it. While American divisions marched south toward a ghost, the Red Army advanced on Berlin against steadily thinning resistance from the west and closed in from the east with overwhelming numerical force. The consequences rippled outward for decades. The Soviet flag over the Reichstag, the division of Germany into occupation zones, a Cold War frontier that hardened roughly where the Western and Soviet armies happened to meet in the spring of 1945. Not the sole cause of any of it, but a real thread running through the decision-making, woven by a lie Joseph Goebbels had invented in a Berlin propaganda office. Then came the discovery. When American forces actually pushed into the Alpine region in late April and early May 1945, they found nothing resembling what the intelligence reports had described. No fortified mountain complex, no underground factories, no stockpiled food or ammunition built to withstand a siege, no fanatical SS army waiting in the passes. On the afternoon of May 4th, 1945, elements of the 7th U.S. Army walked into the area around Berchtesgaden and Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof, and met almost no resistance at all. What they found instead was almost absurdly different. Looted art, mostly. Roughly 6,500 paintings stolen from across occupied Europe, hidden deep in the salt mine at Altaussee, alongside sculpture, tapestry, and rare books ripped from museums and private collections on a continental scale, one of the largest concentrations of stolen cultural property ever assembled in one place. Caches of Reichsbank gold, filing cabinets full of Nazi administrative paperwork, and individual Nazi leaders, not armies, trying to hide or slip away Hermann Göring among them. Taken into American custody in the same Alpine region the intelligence reports had described as an impregnable stronghold, riding in his own chauffeured car with a small mountain of personal luggage and, according to some accounts, a fair portion of his prized art collection still with him. By that same week, SHAEF's own weekly summary was tallying up captured generals and field marshals by the hundreds, rounding up an army of prisoners rather than fighting the army of defenders the intelligence reports had promised. The reality was so much stranger than the fear that preceded it. The Alpenfestung wasn't a fortress that fell in battle. It was a ghost the Allies had been chasing the whole time, and it simply evaporated the moment anyone actually walked into the mountains to look for it. There was a related, genuinely real program that got tangled up in the same myth. Operation Werwolf. In late summer and early autumn of 1944, Himmler ordered SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Preutzmann to organize stay-behind units that could operate behind Allied lines as German territory fell sabotage, targeted killings, disruption of supply and communication. Preutzmann had spent years commanding anti-partisan operations against Soviet guerrillas in occupied Ukraine, and he tried to apply the same tactics in reverse. Recruits trained at a secret facility at Hulkrath Castle on the Rhine, learning demolition, infiltration, and how to improvise explosives from household materials. Roughly 5,000 volunteers, drawn mostly from the SS and the Hitler Youth, went through some version of the training. It was small. It was chronically under-resourced, starved of the same fuel and supplies crippling every other part of the collapsing German war machine. Even Himmler's own foreign intelligence chief, Walter Schellenberg, privately called the whole effort criminal and stupid. Werwolf did manage a handful of real, documented attacks, most notably the assassination of Aachen's Allied-appointed mayor, Franz Oppenhof, in March 1945. But across the entire war, its confirmed body count barely reached double digits. Preutzmann himself never saw any real payoff from the program he'd built. Captured by British forces in May 1945, he took a cyanide capsule rather than face interrogation. The Allies, primed by months of Alpenfestung rumors, assumed Werwolf was the guerrilla army that would eventually fight out of the mountain fortress. Goebbels actively encouraged the confusion, launching a Radio Werwolf propaganda station on April 1, 1945, that had no real connection to Preutzmann's actual unit, but talked as if it did. Even after the war in Europe officially ended, the fear lingered. A massive explosion tore through a U.S. military outpost in Bremen in June 1945, killing more than 40 people. And for years afterwards some attributed it to lingering werewolf sabotage, though the cause was never conclusively established. In reality, the two programs were only loosely connected, and neither one amounted to anything close to the threat either side believed it was. So why didn't the Nazis actually build it? The honest answer is more mundane than the myth. By late 1944, Germany had no spare concrete, no spare fuel, no spare labor for a construction project of that scale. Every resource that still existed was already being fought over by a dozen more urgent priorities. The strategic bombing campaign had gutted the transport network needed to move any of it, even if the raw materials had somehow been available. The army was being ground down simultaneously on two fronts, with nothing left over for a third, hypothetical one in the mountains. And, critically, Hitler himself gave the idea only the thinnest, most symbolic support. He provisionally agreed to elements of it in a January 1945 meeting with Franz Hofer, the regional Gauleiter of Tyrol, who'd been quietly lobbying for exactly this kind of mountain stronghold. And in the war's final week, he did order remaining government personnel evacuated toward the Alps. But he made it unmistakably clear, repeatedly, that he wasn't going himself even after Berlin fell, even with the Red Army closing in around his own bunker. His strategy, to the very end, was to die in the capital, not retreat to a fortress in the mountains. Without the Führer's personal commitment, and without the resources to build it, even if he had wanted to, the Alpenfestung was always going to remain exactly what it started as. Joseph Goebbels' production, played out almost entirely inside Allied mines rather than German rock. So what if Eisenhower had ignored the Alpenfestung intelligence entirely? What if the American army had driven straight for Berlin in March 1945, instead of turning south to chase a fortress that existed only in a propaganda office? It's genuinely possible. The war in Europe could have ended with American troops, not Soviet ones, standing in the ruins of the Reichstag. The map of post-war Germany, the occupation zones, the line that hardened into the Iron Curtain might have looked meaningfully different. A Western capture of Berlin might have reshaped the entire opening decade of the Cold War, from the 1948 Berlin blockade to the division that eventually produced two separate German states. It's worth being careful here, because the Alpenfestung wasn't the only factor pulling Eisenhower south. The wartime agreements already assigning Berlin to the Soviet occupation zone, and Eisenhower's own reluctance to spend American lives storming a heavily defended capital. His political leadership had already agreed to hand over. Both mattered too, arguably mattered more, in the cold calculus of post-war planning that had already happened at conferences like Yalta. But among the most consequential strategic decisions of the 20th century, one of the inputs, sitting right alongside the geopolitics, was a lie. A propaganda minister told about a mountain fortress that was never going to be built. Strip that single input out of the decision, and it's genuinely unclear whether Eisenhower's broad front strategy holds together in quite the same way. The Alpenfestung has become a case study in how intelligence organizations talk themselves into believing what they already fear. Alan Dulles, one of the men whose reporting helped carry the myth toward Eisenhower's desk, went on to become the first civilian director of the CIA in 1953, serving until 1961 and shaping the agency's culture during some of the most consequential years of the early Cold War. The same instincts that shape the Alpenfestung intelligence failure trusting sources who confirm an existing fear, treating a stamped document as settled fact rather than a claim still to be tested, didn't disappear with the war. Historians and intelligence analysts have drawn the same pattern in later conflicts. In Vietnam, American forces spent years hunting for guerrilla strongholds and command structures that turned out to be smaller, more fragmented and less centrally organized than the intelligence had suggested. Decades later, in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, American and Allied intelligence services built a confident public case around weapons of mass destruction programs that, once investigators actually went looking on the ground, weren't there a strikingly similar shape to the discovery Allied troops made walking into the empty Alps in May 1945. None of that makes the Alpenfestung uniquely responsible for what came after. But it's often cited as one of the clearest, earliest documented examples of the pattern intelligence shaped less by what was actually happening on the ground and more by what an already anxious institution was primed to believe. The specific mechanics changed with every decade and every new adversary. The underlying failure mode, an institution mistaking its own fear for evidence, looks remarkably consistent across all of them. The most effective weapon Nazi Germany deployed in the final months of the Second World War wasn't a tank, a rocket, or a division of soldiers. It was a story, a fortress that never had a blueprint, an army that never existed, built entirely out of leaked rumors, forged documents, and the Allies' own fear of exactly this kind of last stand. It cost Joseph Goebbels a propaganda office and a handful of fabricated maps. It cost the Allies weeks of strategic planning, an army group's worth of combat power redirected toward empty mountains, and quite possibly the shape of the post-war map itself. Nobody fired a shot to defend the Alpenfestung because there was never anything there to defend. The war ended anyway, in the ruins of a city hundreds of miles from where Eisenhower had sent his best divisions to look for it.